Testing, 1, 2. Am I good?
You sound good.
That's great. Thank you so much for leaving your gardens and lovely yards to come in and spend this hour with us. I really don't think that you will regret it. My name is Bonnie Withers, and I'm a member of the Hood River County Reads Committee. Now, we are a volunteer committee of the Friends of the Library, and every year, we had one blip thanks to COVID, we have chosen a book to present to the community through workshops, school programs, and public presentation. I believe this is number 16. The book should have broad appeal, be relevant in some way to the broader community, and the author has to agree to spend a weekend with us. And you'll see the whole list in the brochure of the past readings. When I first moved to Hood River 6 years ago, that list became my sort of way to really get myself acclimated to being in the Northwest from Wisconsin. It was a wonderful resource, so I recommend it. Let me pause to thank our intrepid chair, Laurie McDonald, the committee members. We have several here. Committee members, would you just stand up briefly? I know everybody can't see you all. There they are. And they've been working hard. Our wonderful library staff, Rachel Fox, director, it's right over there, and Mo Burford, assistant director. They've been so generous in all ways of assisting us, holding our hands as we wondered until very recently whether we could actually meet in person this year or not. And you saw that in the brochure, you know, maybe this, maybe that, maybe this, maybe that. I want to say hi to my book club colleague, Sandy Montag, who's on the webinar over there. And I hope there'll be some others gathered meeting with us that way as well. So we have that way of being at our programs starting now. We also will have a tape made of this presentation, and it will be available later in the week if you just check your library website. So if you have a friend, you say, oh, you ought to have been there, there's a way for them to see the presentation as well. Now, there are a couple things coming up that along after this that I want to just mention. I want to make sure you know that on May 3rd, Tuesday night, there is a presentation here and on Zoom, Firewise Living in the Gorge by Glenn Ahrens from OSU Forestry. And then Wednesday morning, 10 a.m., there's a field trip, Fire Ecology at Dry Creek. And if you just call the library and say, oh, tell me more about that, I want to do it, we can get you set up for that as well. So let me then go to our main event for today. I couldn't be prouder of the decision the committee made this past year to invite Brian Fies to Hood River to share the background of his wonderful graphic memoir, A Firestory. To remind you again of our committee criteria, is it of wide appeal? Absolutely, it is of wide appeal. We had wonderful, enthusiastic response from our middle and high school students who had a lot of time with Brian on Friday. Our venerable book clubs also, and many of you are here today, responded very positively. And this format certainly is accessible to a very wide range of readers. So another criteria, is it relevant, to our area? I think of the relevance just this morning, looking at the internet and seeing that there are some horrible fires raging right now in New Mexico, with many homes already 200 being destroyed, and it's still raging. So we all know here that we are always in danger of finding ourselves in such a path. And we can learn much from this book about the trials that we may face. Now, will the author come here? Brian agreed readily and graciously and promptly to spend a whirlwind weekend with wife and book hero Karen. Let's take a look at Karen. She's in the back of the room there. And those who read the book know what an important role Karen played in the gorge. And we have really had a fine time with them. And one bonus is I'm sure that a many number of you may already be familiar with graphic novels, or you can call them comics. That's perfectly fine. But I know also that we were able to introduce this literary form to a new audience, and that's very exciting. And the library has lots more wonderful books like this for you to explore. So rather than read the details of his biography from the brochure, because you can do that for yourself, I happen to know that Brian will tell you about his background in a much more interesting manner. So please help me welcome Brian Fies to the present.
That was lovely. Thank you, Bonnie. I just have to start by thanking all of you, the Hood River Reads Committee, and frankly, the whole community. I've never been here before. I've been to Portland and I've been around, but this is my first time in the gorge, and we have just had the best time. We've been here now. I think this is our 4th day. The natural beauty goes without remarking because it's just extraordinary. We drove up to Hood Mountain, or Mount Hood this morning. We drove up to government camp, and just had a terrific drive up that way. So we love the terrain, but more than that, we just fall in love with the people. I mean, you've just been so kind to us, so gracious, and just so down home, and taking us to your favorite hole-in-the-wall restaurant, your favorite very, very nice restaurant. I love the junior high kids. I love the high school kids. I don't know how you grow them here, but they're all like smart and polite and attentive, and it's just I was very impressed with the students and the facilities and just this library and the library staff. I know why people fall in love with this place and move here. So thank you all very much for that wonderful introduction. This is going to be kind of a wide-ranging talk, and I'm going to talk a little bit about graphic novels and why it's my chosen medium, because I know graphic novels are new and sometimes strange for people who've just not read them before. If the last comic you read was, Casper the Friendly Ghost when you were 8 years old, you look at this and you say, what the heck is this? Somebody made a comic book about his house burning down? That's the strangest thing I've ever heard of. I get that. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and why I think graphic novels are a legitimate literary medium that aren't necessarily just for juvenile literature. They don't have to be funny. They don't have to be for kids. They can be as legitimate a form of literature as any novel you want to speak about, or any nonfiction work you want to speak about. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. My defense of graphic novels. I'm going to talk about my fire, of course, and then I hope I'm going to transition toward the end and talking toward that fire readiness talk you're going to have coming up. I'll talk a little about what we've learned from our fire, and maybe those are lessons that would help other people prepare for their future fires, because your future fires are coming, and you better be ready for them. My background is, I was talking to some people before we got started here. I majored in physics in college, where I met Karen, just because I loved physics. But I minored in English. I wrote, ended up with an English minor just because I took so many English classes that I accidentally got a minor in the subject, just because I loved writing. And my first job out of college, I was a night shift part-time sports reporter at a newspaper. So I became a newspaper reporter. I've been a freelance journalist. I've been an environmental chemist. I've been a science writer. I've had a lot of careers. But all through that, the thread that sort of guided me was I really wanted to be a cartoonist or an artist of some sort. As long as I can remember, age 3, 4, I wanted to make comics. And so something about that I had these other jobs, I could do these other things, but I kept trying to be a cartoonist. And when I was in my early 40s, actually, I had a chance to turn professional at it when my mother was diagnosed and treated for lung cancer. And I made first a webcomic, and then I published a book called Mom's Cancer, which got some notice and is actually still, many years after its publication, being taught in medical school these days. And I gave a little talk about that yesterday, so sorry you missed it. My second graphic novel was called Whatever Happened to the World of Tomorrow, and it's the hardcover and paperback down here. And it's a book I wrote about being a space-age kid, getting to the age I am now, and wondering why I'm not living on the moon with a flying car like they promised me. I was made promises, and they were not kept.
Yeah.
What it's really about is it's sort of my examination of that arc of American history from the 30s to say the 70s or 80s, where we went from optimistic utopianism to pessimistic dystopianism. We used to think tomorrow would be better and scientists were the good guys. And now we're all pretty sure tomorrow's gonna be horrible and scientists are more or less the bad guys. How did we, what's that arc? What happened to us? That's kind of what that book examines through a kind of a pop culture, comic booky, Walt Disney lens. And then this book here, The Last Mechanical Monster, was a webcomic I did a few years ago. It was a reminder to myself that sometimes comics can be serious, it can be adult, and can be as, you know, as grim or whatever as you want, but sometimes they should just be dopey fun. So I made a comic about an old man as giant robot, and it's going to be published as a book this fall. So anybody who wants to collect Brian Fies, you know, have no idea what you're getting when you buy one of my books. I do not apparently have a unified style. Much to my detriment, as I think, as an author. So that was more or less the extent of my cartooning career. I'd contributed to some anthologies, and I'd done some little things, and I illustrated a light bulb catalog once. But this is more or less my professional cartooning career as of the night of October 9th, 2017, when Karen woke us up at 1:15, 1:30 in the morning, and we saw this coming over the hill at us. This is the leading edge of what I called in my book a napalm tsunami. This is a picture I took up my front door of a wave of fire coming down a canyon and over the hills toward us. This is another picture of the same thing that I didn't take, somebody else took. Now, all the stuff down in the foreground there is just overexposed streetlights, but everything up on the horizon, all of that and that and that and that, that's all the Tubbs fire, which is one of 7 or 8 fires that erupted this night in Sonoma and Mendocino counties. It's just one fire. And I think my house is right about here. But skipping ahead, I mean, or taking a little detour, the problem with a fire like this is never the fire, it's always the wind, right? We had 70, 80, 90 mile-an-hour winds going from east to west, from right to left, pushing this fire and skipping it. So embers would lift off from here, they'd go to here, and they'd go to here, and they'd go to here. And I have a little breakdown of what our fire looked like. This is a map of our fire. And so just to help you get, this is Sonoma County, California. This is Napa County, California. This is the town of Santa Rosa. Everything, every gray mark is a building, right? And the scale here is about 20, 25 miles from corner to corner. That's about 20 miles. So the fire starts up here, this little brown speck, about 9:15 at night. Little brown speck. And about a half hour later, it's grown a little bit. A half hour later, it's grown a little bit more. But it's really not doing any damage yet. This is still back up in the hills, and it's heavily forested. And maybe I see 1 or 2 structures here that have been damaged, but it's not terrible. This is about 10:15. This is about when Karen and I went to bed that night. And we turned on the 10 o'clock news, and the news story way down in the middle of the newscast said, oh, there's a fire up by Calistoga, which is the town up here. And we didn't worry about that because that was so far from us, and we had no concerns, and we went to sleep. Half hour later, it grew into that, and now every red dot is a destroyed home or building. Half hour later, it grew into that. Half hour later, that. This is about midnight, about 12:15. And so it's being pushed by these 90-mile-an-hour winds coming off, basically coming out of Nevada, more or less, bone dry, and shoving it down this way, right toward the town of Santa Rosa. About 12:45. This is about when we woke up, about 1:15. Our home is right here. We woke up, we got out. If you've read the book, you know that part of the story. We figure about 1:45 or 2 o'clock, our home was destroyed. And now this right here, this is Highway 101. This is a major freeway. That's a 6-lane freeway, 3 lanes each direction. You think, well, that's a fire break. The fire can't possibly jump over Highway 101. Boom, it flew right over 101. This right here is about 1,500 homes. Just that right there. This is, you might have heard of the area of Coffee Park. This is Coffee Park that just went up. This is all, this is rich people's homes up in the hills. We have friends who lost their homes up there. And this is the Tubbs fire that in a matter of something like 4 or 5 hours went from here to here and destroyed several thousand homes. That's the view from space. I shouldn't have taken that out. I should have put that back. This is San Francisco right here. So here's San Francisco Bay. We're right up in here. And you see the wind, again, this wind coming from the north and the east that's just pushing all these fires. That's a fire, that's a fire, that's a fire, that's a fire. These are 2 fires up here. This is Mendocino County, which is actually pretty similar to your kind of terrain. It's very heavily wooded, forested, very mountainous, not densely populated, but very, very hard to fight fires back up here in Mendocino County. So this is, you know, if there's an analog to what you might face, it's what was going on up here. So the night we evacuated, we didn't know any of that, right? Nobody knew anything. Nobody knew where the fire was. Nobody really knew where it had been. We didn't know if our house still existed or not. So the next morning at dawn, while Karen was working heroically to set up shelters all around our county, I walked back into our neighborhood. And the situation was still so dire that there were no cops or firefighters to stop me from walking into our neighborhood. There were no roadblocks because they were still busy evacuating people and fighting fire somewhere else. I just walked down the street. And when I got to my neighborhood, I saw this. This is my street. These are my redwood trees up here. And that's my front door. I'm just gonna keep holding this. This is a refrigerator. This is a washer or dryer, I don't remember. And you can see these little spot fires all over the place in the back here. But what always astonishes me about this image is this is about 8 in the morning and the fire burned about 2 in the morning. In 6 hours, not only had this fire destroyed 200 houses plus thousands of others, but the 200 houses in my neighborhood, but it had more or less gone out by then. It was just that intense, that fast, that it just went right through like a blowtorch and destroyed the whole neighborhood in, you know, something like 5 or 6 hours. That's astonishing speed and power and horrible, you know, terrible strength. The next day, again, if you've read the book, you know that we went to live with our daughters for a month. They lived about 35 miles away, halfway between us and San Francisco. We have 2 grown daughters who share an apartment, and they let us move in with them. So we did something right. They took us in. They let us move in with them, and we all got along, and we all still love each other. So blessings for that. But the next day, I went to a Target store down in Nevada where they live, and I bought shoes because I'd evacuated wearing sandals because I was an idiot. That was the first thing by the bed that night, and I grabbed the sandals. So I'm walking around in this in sandals, feeling the heat through the bottom of my sandals. And I bought, you know, underwear, and I bought socks, and I bought shoes, and like I said, and shirts, and I bought art supplies. These are the only art supplies I could find at Target. It's a spiral-bound book of very bad paper, 4 colored highlighters, and a Sharpie pen. That's the art supplies I bought. And I started drawing pictures like this. Because I think it was sort of a journalist in me. I was a newspaper reporter once, and I think I wanted to, I realized I happened to have found myself in the middle of an historic disaster, and I felt an obligation to tell people about it. I felt like, you know, like a war correspondent on the front lines of a battle kind of thing is how I felt about that. And so I wanted to tell our family's story. I wanted to tell it in the form of graphic, of comics. And so I started writing and drawing things like this. While I walked into our neighborhood, I had two things going on in my head as I walked into my neighborhood that morning. One was just the shock of looking around and realizing my neighborhood had been destroyed. And if you've read the book, that's the one obscenity of the book is me realizing that my neighborhood had been destroyed. But the other reaction is I always feel like I go through life with this pair of eyeballs floating over my shoulder, watching me watch the world. And while I'm in shock looking at my neighborhood, I've got this pair of eyes saying, okay, you're going into shock, but pay attention because you're going to be writing about this. And so I started taking pictures of what I saw because I knew I'd need it later to draw it. So I took photos like the one on the left of a melted fire hose that I interpreted the drawing on the right. I took a picture of a melted basketball hoop that I rendered. I took a picture of our mailboxes melted. These are stainless steel poles that just folded over. That's my mailbox right there. I pried it open a couple weeks later just to see if there's anything in it. There wasn't. And I drew pictures like this, or took pictures and drew pictures like this. This is the front of my house. There's that refrigerator again. And I put myself into the story. As I say, I wanted to tell the story. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to get out in the world as soon as I could. And the easiest, best, fastest, cheapest way to do that is to put it online. I have a blog, so I put it on a blog. And I do 16 pages of comics in 3 days, which is a meteoric rate. And that's why the drawing is so bad, because I was drawing very fast rate of production for a comic. And it was also not the only thing I was worried about because my house just burned down and I was trying to deal with that too. This was not the most important thing in my life, but it was important for me to tell this story. In the next 2 weeks, something like 700,000 people went and read this comic. It went viral quickly. And I take some credit for that. I'm very pleased that I wrote and drew a comic good enough that 700,000 people wanted to read it. But what I really attribute that to is the fact that people told me, they wrote and told me, I saw your disaster in the news. I saw the mushroom cloud rising over the Santa Rosa plain. But your comic was the only thing that made me understand what it was like to be there. And that's the value of comics. That's the value of graphic novels. And that's why I did it as a graphic novel. That's why I did it at all. So this next part is a little harrowing. By the way, I should have said at the start, if you've heard any of my talks in the last 4 days, some of this is repetitive. I've only got so many stories. And if you've seen Charlie Brown before, you're going to see Charlie Brown again. I'm just giving you a heads up. You'll all understand that reference in a few minutes. But I think it's important to, first of all, I assume there are many people who haven't heard the story, but I'm building to something. I'm working on it. So a couple of weeks after, a very short time after this came out, a PBS station, KQED in San Francisco, sent me an email and they said, hey, would you mind if we animated that, your story? And I said, knock yourselves out, I'm not gonna animate it. And so I sent them all my art files and they produced a 6.5 minute video that I am hoping desperately works. The sound is going to be very quiet because it's all coming out of my computer, but we tried this out before we got going and I'm gonna hold the microphone over there and hope it picks up something. So please bear with us and I'd like to show you this video that KQED produced.
On Monday, my house disappeared. Around 1 a.m., my wife Karen snapped awake. The electricity had gone out.
I smell smoke.
That's just the Calistoga fire. It's 20 miles from here.
The sky is blue.
Clothes I packed. 2 pairs of socks, t-shirt, sweatshirt, flannel shirt, toiletry bag, 2 tidy white jeans, shirt, jacket, sandals I put on, stuff we grabbed, photo albums, few framed photos and art, 1 copy of each of my books, jewelry, important papers, computer backup USB drives, dog, cat, and their stuff, our daughter's best stuffed buddies from infancy, Pooh Bear and Piglet. Our neighborhood lies along a creek between Napa and Sonoma counties. Monday night, a blaze that began 20 miles away near Calistoga caught 50-mile-per-hour winds. A flaming front swept down the creek and broke over the hills like a napalm tsunami. We were at the tip of the bellows, feeding a blast furnace. We didn't know any of that when we left at 1:30 a.m. The idea of that distant glow in the sky actually making its way to us was ludicrous.
Where shall we go?
Your office. Karen is director of Sonoma County Human Services. Her office has a backup generator, phones and internet, and a soda machine. It's also only a few miles from our house. Besides, it was time for her to get to work. Between 2 and 7 a.m., Karen activated emergency phone trees, organized shelters, and planned the evacuation of our foster children's home as fire bore down from 3 sides.
How many kids? No, you can't go west. The highway just closed. When will the cops arrive?
She was too busy to think. At dawn, I set out to get as close to home as I could.
You don't do anything stupid.
Who, me? The sun was a dim orange disk in a salmon gray curtain of smoke. I inhaled my neighbors' lives. I drove to the first roadblock, parked in a nearby lot, and started walking. These blocks looked all right. Everything would be just fine. The street made a gentle curve into our neighborhood. As I rounded it, I knew.
That's a bad word.
So's that.
I picked my way down the middle of the street to avoid smoldering debris that collapsed into gutters, alone on a sterile plain. Black toothpick trees, madly tilting chimneys, and the twisted steel frames of garage doors. Hell, a fire hose split and melted on the street. A valiant glass stand routed into retreat. A fallen hoop that a boy lobbed balls at for hours every night after dinner. The steel posts and mailboxes bent like hot summer taffy. I turned onto my street, stupidly hoping to see anything else. I used to have 5 redwood trees in my front yard. I see a refrigerator with the rough shape of a car I used to have in my garage. I don't recognize anything else. The 2-story house full of my life was a 2-foot heap of dead smoking ash. I called Karen and told her she'd just become one of the thousands of refugees she was helping.
Hey, I'm here in front of the house.
I tried to call a neighbor to tell her too, but reception was bad and I ended up yelling at her.
Your house is gone. It's all gone. No, gone.
It would have almost been funny if I weren't worried of her life. Beginning the long trudge back, I passed a pristine Starbucks only a few hundred yards from home. Starbucks? How was that fair? Karen was a hero the rest of the day. With 9/10 of her staff out, she led a team that improvised and problem solved. It was impressive. In quiet moments, we inventory lost treasures, each a swift stab to the heart. We didn't save the wrong stuff, we just didn't save enough of it. A time capsule to be opened in 2030, a series of photo strips taken by cramming our family into a booth at the county fair every summer for 18 years. My mom's diamond earrings we planned to reset and give to our girls on their next birthday. Everything I drew or painted, everything else. On Tuesday, I bought shoes for walking and boots for digging. I saw things I needed 2 days earlier, furnace filters, printer ink, light bulbs, and realized I didn't anymore. It's unnerving to need both everything and nothing. My keyring has 5 keys. 3 of them don't do anything anymore. Front door, mailbox melted on sidewalk, car incinerated in garage. I wonder how long it'll be before I can bear to take them off. Karen and I know dozens burned out. A friend caring for his husband with Alzheimer's. The widow of a famous cartoonist who lost decades of priceless artwork. A retired FBI agent who lost a presentation firearm. A family with an autistic son whose life is anchored in routine. They haven't told him yet. He thinks they're on vacation. Mary on the corner who can't find her cat Lucy. Thousands of homes have been destroyed in this firestorm. Ours was one. I'm self-aware enough to recognize the classic symptoms. Sleeplessness, loss of appetite, mental lapses, mood swings. Sadly, understanding trauma doesn't really help relief. When we were allowed back to our house, we found a foot-deep fog bank of ash. Glass melted, china fused, concrete exploded, steel twisted, aluminum trickled down driveways. Maybe one day we will appreciate our fresh start. Not yet. Not for a long, long time. Well-meaning people say it's just stuff, but it was our stuff. Stuff we created, stuff we treasured. Stuff from our ancestors we wanted our descendants to have. Stuff is a marker of time and memory. It's home. I started drawing it the day after the fire. My wife says it's therapy for me. And I think that's true. I also think I very much felt the need to do something. And I couldn't run an emergency operations center. I'm not a firefighter, but I could tell the story in a very personal, very intimate way.
It worked. That was obviously me and Karen narrating our own lives. That was very strange to have the producer from KQED come to our daughter's apartment with, you know, a load of equipment and record us doing that. But it was really special. The KQED broadcast that and they put it online, and NPR picked it up and put it online, and it went on to win an Emmy Award for Best News Feature Story. So I got to charge that tuxedo to my insurance company. Luckily, I did not let that kind of success go to my head. And from that, I had the opportunity to turn that into a book called The Firestory. You would recognize some of that story. If you've read the book, you recognize that what you just saw is the rough draft of the book. And that's the way I look at it. It was like the first draft of what I sort of always secretly intended might be a book, but wasn't sure until my editor called me and said, no pressure, Brian, but if you want to turn that webcomic into a book, we'd love to publish it. And this is my pro tip for anybody who wants to be a writer out there is when a publisher calls and says, we'd like to publish your stuff, you say yes. That's my pro tip. So do that. As you've read, the art in a Firestory looks like this, and it looks like this. And I've occasionally get questions about my coloring choices, my stylistic choices here. What I was trying to do with the very limited palette of, I think, 6 or 7 colors, if you include gray as a color, and this kind of streaky effect is, I really wanted to capture or recapture the energy of the original, which was done with those highlighters and those bold Sharpie pens. I wanted to capture that energy. Now, of course, these days you do this all with Photoshop, but that was the effect I was trying to convey, was to just have that energy continue. And so when I had the opportunity to do the book, you know, the original webcomic was 16, and then expanded to 18 pages. A book is a lot bigger than that. So I wanted to expand the story in scope. I wanted to talk about a larger span of time. I want to talk about weeks instead of days. I want to talk, give some context for our disaster, why it happened, how it happened. I wanted to tell other people's fire stories in that book, not just mine, because I realized my perspective was limited by where I was physically and also where I was socioeconomically, kind of, you know, middle class. And so I wanted to talk to people who were poorer than me and richer than me and living in other places than me. And so I went out and I just interviewed them and I got their stories. So one thing I wanted to do was I wanted to give some environmental context to it. So I started talking about, there's a passage in there, I won't read this whole thing, but about our climate, about the Mediterranean climate of Sonoma County, about the fact that we used to have these very wet winters. They're not so wet anymore because we've been in a drought for a long time. But wet winters, very dry springs, summers, and falls. And you know, it's a beautiful climate for growing grapes, but it's a hazard for fire, especially when exacerbated by years/decades of drought. I wanted to talk about the science of the fire, and this is just me. This is the old physics major in me coming out, but I was fascinated by the science of fire, of going through my stuff, shoveling through my ashes and saying, why does this look like this? Why did this happen? So this is a quirk of mine, and some people think it's a little strange, but I sort of did a little forensic analysis of my own site to, you know, and learned that concrete crumbles at 500 Fahrenheit, and you know, barbecue legs melt at 1200 Fahrenheit, and the glass lamp on your patio melts at 1400 Fahrenheit. A trophy you got once melts at 1500, and your copper pipes in your water system melt at 2000 Fahrenheit, and the steel I-beams that hold up your garage door melt at 2600 Fahrenheit. I found this fascinating because there might be something wrong with me. One weird thing I noticed was that everything rusted. Overnight, everything was rusty. You go back to it and everything metal was, it looked like it had been left out in the elements for 40 years and had been out for a week. And that was because of the chemistry of the fire. Fire oxidized everything. As I say here, electron swap oxides such as hematite and magnetite turn into rust as they suck moisture from the air. I didn't know fire could do that. And I just found this a fascinating process. I did go out and interview those other people, And again, if you've read the book, you've read these stories. I think these are the best parts of the book. So, you know, the gentleman on the left, Mike Harkins, was a friend of mine from before the fire, and he heroically tried to save his block with a fire hose. He was the last person left in his block. He ran up and down the street without a fire hose, a garden hose, not a fire hose, a garden hose, with just spraying fire hose water on every little, garden hose water on every little ember he saw hit the ground. All night long he did that. And because of that, he probably saved several homes on his block, except his own. He was not able to save his own house. But there was actually, it turned out later on, a video of a fire engine, fire brigade, I guess, from Berkeley coming up to Santa Rosa to fight the fire. And one of the firefighters was taking a video, and they have video of him standing at the end of his block with a fire hose, trying to put the fire out. And one of the firefighters just says, that guy, that's either the bravest or craziest man I've ever seen in my life. You know? So I talked to Mike Harkin. Some people ask, how did you find these people to tell their stories? And the sad thing is, you couldn't throw a rock without finding somebody with an interesting or fascinating or horrific or inspiring fire story. And these people were some of them. So if you read nothing else in my book, read these people's stories, because I think they're just wonderful stories about wonderful people. Why a comic? All right, now I'm gonna do a little left turn into, I'm gonna make my best case for graphic graphic novels as a legitimate art form. And this is the part might be repetitive for those of you who've seen my other 5 talks. In my opinion, comics are a combination of words and images that together transcend the sum of their parts. I always like to compare comics to popular music. If you just write down the words, the lyrics of your favorite song of all time, usually the lyrics are just pretty bad poetry. And if you just listen to the music without the words of your favorite song of all time, usually the music is not that interesting either. It's 3 chords, it's repetitive, the music is not great. But when you put those lyrics together with that music, then you've got a thing that can remind you of the summer you turned 16 years old, or the first time you fell in love, or that can define a generation. That's the power of a song, to take words that maybe you're a little not that great, music that's not that interesting, put them together, and you've got this transcendent thing that exceeds the sum of its parts. I think comics work like that too. I think comics combine words and pictures in a way that exceeds the sum of its parts. One reason they do that, I think, is that comics distill reality, or comics distill ideas and reality to their essence. And what I mean by that is, when I'm making a comic, my goal is always to start with reality and then strip away everything that's not necessary. Strip away all the detail that's not necessary until I just have like one pure gem of an idea that I'm trying to communicate to you, and you're going to get it. You're going to get it without thinking about it. Now, if you strip away too much, then you become incomprehensible and they don't get the idea at all. So the trick, the goal is strip away everything that's extraneous until you get this just one pure nugget of an idea. That's what I try to do when I'm making comics. And my favorite example of this is Charlie Brown. I love this. This is my favorite example of how comics work, the beauty and the wonder of comics, and why they're such an effective art form. Charlie Brown is 2 dots, a half a circle, and a squiggly line. That's all Charlie Brown is. Charlie Brown is 4 India ink marks on a white piece of paper, and Charlie Brown will break your heart. Charlie Brown, when Charlie Brown picks out the wrong tree and all the kids laugh at him, or he doesn't get Valentine's on Valentine's Day, Charlie Brown can break your heart because you empathize with this. How do we empathize with 4 black marks on a white piece of paper? You know, I think it speaks of something very deep about human beings. And you know, you talk about child development theory and about how the first thing children recognize is the face of their mother. We're programmed to feel emotions when we see this arrangement of symbols, and we imprint on this. We care about this. We want to know what happens to this. We want the best for this, and I think that's part of why comics are such a powerful medium. This was explained by a cartoonist whom I never met actually, but a gentleman named Larry Gonick, who did cartoons called the cartoon history of the universe, the cartoon history of Earth. And Larry said, our brains represent things in some stripped down, abstracted way. We don't remember things as photographs or movies. We remember them as cartoons. And I think that's exactly right. I think that's why comics work, is if you think back to some important event in your life, you don't remember it in photographic detail. You don't have an audio recording of it. What you remember is, you don't remember what color the drapes were. You don't remember what the carpet was like, or if it was hardwood or carpet. What you remember is who was there, what happened, how it made you feel. You remember reality stripped to its essence. You're remembering a cartoon of that event. And I think this is why occasionally cartoons, comics, can feel like telepathy. When a comic's really clicking, it feels like a direct tap from my brain, the creator's brain, into the reader's brain. And with no intermediary, they don't have to think about it. They get the meaning of what you're trying to tell them before they even have time to process it. And I think that's because our brains work like cartoons, I think. We now enter the academic portion of our talk. These properties of comics help the reader process meaning directly without intermediary analysis or translation. That's exactly what I was just saying. You get the meaning before you have time to even think about it. When you're reading a prose book, you have to take in the words, analyze the words, process the words, understand the words. With a comic, that happens faster and more direct. A comic is like an injection of, I don't know, heroin into the bloodstream or something, something healthier than that. Comics encourage empathy and universality. A comics theorist named Scott McCloud said that abstraction invites engagement. And what he means by that is the Charlie Brown example of Charlie Brown is so minimal, so stylized. There's so little to Charlie Brown and his world that we have no choice but to fill in the missing pieces with our own lives, to pour our own selves into this vessel that is empty or almost empty. And I think that's true. I think because comics are so stylized, we fill the missing information with information from our own lives. And these properties, I think, make comics ideal for memoir and intimate internal narratives. And I have some examples in a bit, but if you think about the best, most famous, well-known graphic novels, there's Mouse and Persepolis and New Kid by Jerry Craft just won the Newbery Medal. Mouse won the Pulitzer Prize. Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. There are all these memoirs. There are all these stories about people's inner thoughts and feelings and hopes and dreams. And I think that goes back to the fact that because our hopes and dreams exist in our brains in the stripped down, abstracted form that is very analogous to a comic. So I argue that comics are not pre, post, non, or illiterate. And I had, bless their hearts, I had some teachers tell me in the junior high, well, you know, I love comics because they get the reluctant readers to read. And I love that. I think that's wonderful. And I have cartoonist friends who take great pride that that's what their books accomplish. It's huge for them. But that's not all comics can be. I think comics are a different type of literacy. Reading comics demands a form of literacy that asks the reader to knit together pictures and words in their own mind to understand how the pictures and words fit together. And it makes the reader almost a co-conspirator in the story. They almost become a storyteller themselves because they have to take in these two different things and figure out how they go together. It's like a little puzzle the reader has to solve. In fact, when I'm writing my books, I often think of them as me creating a series of little puzzles that I leave clues and trails for the reader to solve. And you get that little shot of endorphin, and you know you're having a good reading experience. Some examples of some good graphic novels. God, there are just so many. Epileptic by David B. Stitches by David Small. All of these are just wonderful books about real people telling real stories about the real life. I mentioned Mouse, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Fun Home, Persepolis. Smile is a great one. Smile by my friend Brendan Telgemeier basically created a whole new genre of children's or middle-aged reader literature. She's the Stephen King of graphic novels. I mean, or the J.K. Rowling. And Smile is just a terrific book. If you've got 12 or 13-year-old and you want to get them into graphic novels or they're interested in graphic novels, Hand and Smile. It's just a terrific book. As I said, graphic novels have overcome some of the stigma I'm trying to overcome, and they've won the Pulitzer Prize and the Newbery Medal and the National Book Award. This series of books called March by Congressman John Lewis and Anton Aden and Nate Powell is just a terrific series about John Lewis's life and his struggles in the civil rights movement. And you know, you could hand that book to, you can teach that book in any high school history class in America. It should be taught in every high school class in America. So I'd like to do just a few readings, if you don't mind. And I just realized that you just saw this one on the movie, but you can tell at a glance if a shopper has lost everything they own. Underwear, socks, shoes, bottled water, toothpaste and toothbrush, one light shirt, one heavy shirt. You look into their cart, they look into yours. Sometimes it sparks a conversation, usually a nod. This is me at the Target store. A couple of weeks, or probably less than a week after we moved in with our daughters, I had to make some phone calls. I had to call our insurance company and our utility and set things straight. So I called our I called our utility and said, yes, I need to cancel our gas and electric service. We lost our home in the wildfires. Oh, I'm so sorry, sir. We can take care of that right away. I just need to ask a few questions. Are you transferring service to another address? Eventually, we don't know where yet. Are there any fences or locked gates blocking the electric meter? No, the entire neighborhood burned to the ground. I'm sorry, but I need to go down the checklist. No, no fences or gates. You plan to move any gas appliances? I don't have any appliances, gas or otherwise. Are there dogs on the property? And by telling the story, my dog Riley always perks up when she knows we're talking about her. You understand what happened, right? The checklist, no dogs. And will our workers have clear access to the gas meter? Unlimited access, but there's no gas meter there anymore. I called our auto insurance. And what is the estimated repair cost? Same guy. Whatever it would cost to buy another 5-year-old Honda. So you would describe the vehicle as a total loss? Yes, it's totally totaled. Oh, I see. I took some pictures I can send to you. Do they show the license plate or vehicle ID number? No, those melted. Being part of something so big makes perspective elusive. During the fire, we lived in a bubble. We saw very little television, heard nothing from the world outside. Friends and relatives across the country knew more about what had happened here than we did. Weeks later, we still lived in a bubble, a tiny bubble of our family, our property, our losses, our problems. Then we take a drive, mile after mile, hour after hour, ruin after ruin, thousands of other people's bubbles as real and urgent as ours. There's a ridge in the Fountain Grove neighborhood where you can look down into a valley a couple of miles below. On the other side of that valley is a distant ridge that parallels the one you're on. Beyond that ridge, a farther row of higher hills. Virtually everything you can see from horizon to horizon burned that night. All in all, the firestorms claimed about 350 square miles. It's a big number that by itself means nothing. It's about 15 Manhattans, 7.5 San Franciscos, 1.5 Chicago's, 1/3 of Rhode Island. Perspective, it's the comfort and horror of realizing you're not alone.
Right, 3. Should we have some lunch then?
That's why I came up here.
Yeah.
I'm looking at all this.
Reading,
I just build a plate and then you look at it.
Yeah.
Maybe my favorite. Karen and I are cleaning out our lot. We're digging through the ashes, and I say, "Oh hell, here comes a chaplain." Karen says, "Your turn." We had a lot of chaplains come around. 8 groups sent around crisis counselors from time to time. "Hi," I say. He says, "You folks need some water?" They were kind, earnest people who meant painfully well. "Thanks," I replied. "We set up a food truck a few blocks over, free falafels." "We'll come by in a while, thank you." "How are y'all doing?" "Oh, you know," I say, "same as everybody." "Yeah, I've seen a lot of blocks that look just like this." "At least we all got out alive," I tell him. There was an older couple over that way who got trapped in their garage. Yeah, we heard. Horrible. But at least they perished together. Well, we're grateful. Not as bad as Hurricane Katrina, though. I saw bodies floating in ditches there. So the chaplain and I have a moment. And then I go back to work, and he goes back to, back to his truck. And Karen says, "How'd it go?" And I said, "Pretty well. He just needed someone to talk to." At the time, this struck me as funny. And I wrote it down immediately. This is verbatim. This is the conversation, because I knew it would be part of the story. And it only a little later did it strike me as just one of the saddest things I've seen in a long time, because he so badly wanted to help. He was trying so hard to help, but he just had nothing left to give. He had no gas left in his tank. He was a sponge that had been wrung dry, and all he could do was absorb from others. So I think that's my feedback. I think I'm feeding back. I'm gonna move back just a little bit. But oh, I know what it is. It's the online thing. Okay. It just struck me as such a sad thing that, I was comforting him and not the other way around, which was an intent. And he had no business being there, but he was there. He was trying to help, but he was just burned out. He'd been in too many disasters. I have so much empathy and sympathy for this man, but he should not have been out there. One more reading, A Day in the New Life. I did a series of these little 4-panel things throughout the book, kind of sprinkling through, almost like comic strips. They were just a moment, a day in the life. And this was one of them. Karen and I were out shopping somewhere, and Karen says, "These are nice looking watches." And I kind of pull up short. She says, "What's wrong?" And I say, "I can't remember if I own a watch." Karen says, "Did you put one on when we evacuated?" I said, "No." And she says, "Then you don't own a watch." So I'd like to sort of start winding up here with a talk about resilience. And I address resilience in the paperback edition of A Firestory. So if you don't have the paperback edition, this is something you haven't seen before. But in that, I wrote a page that talks about kintsugi, which is the centuries-old Japanese art of repairing broken ceramics with gold. Instead of trying to hide damage, kintsugi highlights and celebrates as a part of the object's history. I have a deep appreciation for kintsugi as I watch my neighborhood rebuild. Some survivors want all evidence of the fire erased, plowed under, paved over, painted away. I understand but disagree. I like my warped and rusted iron gate and the spots where our burning trash cans melted the street. These occasional small reminders don't bother me. They tell our story. They're the scars we earned, our kintsugi. Our fire was one of those 100-year disasters or 1,000-year disasters that's only supposed to happen, and it's only due to climate change, and it's just a horrific one-off, event that could never happen again. This is the footprint of the Tubbs fire that destroyed my house. And keeping all that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to the Hanley fire of 1964. This is the footprint of that fire. The difference between the Hanley fire in 1964 and the Tubbs fire in 2017 is there were not 6,000 people living in this land in 1964. And the Hanley fire covered that amount of territory in about 6 days, and the Tubbs fire covered it in about 4 hours. So there's a couple of things going on there. One is the whole land use debate about the conflict between private and public use of space. What right do folks have to their own property? Are there some places that are just too dangerous to build? I've got friends who rebuilt up in those hills. I think they're crazy, I'll tell you the truth. But if somebody had come to me and said, "No, Brian, you can't rebuild your house," I would have punched them in the nose, because that land was all I had left. That was my home. You can't take that away from me. So I don't have an answer to that. I'm saying it's a fraught question. But the fact is, in 1964, this was all ranches with, you know, sheep and cows and chickens and plum orchards. And in 2017, it's a lot of subdivisions and, you know, stuff that didn't used to be there. That's a political problem. That's a social problem. That's not a climate change problem. The climate change problem is what I talked about. Is the Hanley fire took a week to do that, and the Tubbs fire took a couple hours to do that. That's the climate change problem. And I came between the hardcover and softcover paperback editions. I really came to see a Firestory as a book about living in a climate changed world. And I wasn't that convinced about that when the first book came out, because our Firestory did seem like a one-off. It seemed like, well, that's a disaster, but those people, you know, their luck stunk. But you know, when my fire happened, it was the most destructive wildfire in California history. The next year, the town of Paradise up by Chico burned. Twice as much land, twice as many homes, twice as many lives lost. It became the most destructive wildfire in California history. The next year, there was another fire that became the most destructive wildfire in California history. That's not a record that should be broken every year. And that's what sort of convinced me that this was not a book about a one-off disaster. This was a book that's about something we're all going to face in one way or another. This is a book about living in a climate change world and how we deal with it. And with that in mind, I'd like to talk a little about some lessons we learned, I think, in Sonoma County that we like to try to export every chance we get. One is the importance of organization and responsibility. At the time of the 2017 fire, fire response was divided among many different organizations. City, county, volunteer, CAL FIRE, which is like the state fire agency. All this was divided, and they didn't know what each other were doing. We heard many stories of CAL FIRE sending firefighters up to there, and some cities sending fires down to there, and they meet on the road and say, well, there's a fire coming this way behind me, and they'd say, well, there's a fire coming this way behind me. And neither of them knew what, you know, they were trying to send mutual aid in opposite directions to no good end whatsoever. What we've done in Sonoma County since then is we've wrapped a lot of that up in the emergency, what's it called, Karen? The emergency management department. Office of Emergency Services, thank you. That should be on here somewhere because I forget it every time. But the Office of Emergency Services now is charged with coordinating that. It's a newly created county office to coordinate those efforts, to get those people working together, to drill them together, to set up the avenues of communication so that they're all talking to each other and everybody understands what everybody's doing. Everybody knows the plan. Everybody's working on the same plan. That's what that office does. We've also made some technological leaps, and they're simple, stupid things. The first thing we did is we bought a bunch of fire cams. Since 2017, we bought the county bought 27 new wildfire cameras, probably more since then. And we put them on every bubble land that was higher than a fire hydrant. We put them everywhere. This is 50 miles of territory. You can see how many fire cameras are on there. And these things are driven by artificial intelligence or run by artificial intelligence, so that if there's a puff of smoke anywhere, the computer recognizes it. You don't have to have somebody in a fire tower with binoculars watching these things. The computer sees a puff of smoke, they triangulate it, and they hit it with everything they got as fast as they can. All right? They know where the fire is, they know how big it is, they know what to do about it, and they have the goal, the mission to strike as quickly as they can with as much firefighting force as they can. That's very important. And the other point I made here is codes, building codes. My house that burned down was 30 years old. And it was fine, it was a nice house. But when we built our house, fire codes had changed significantly in California, so that now new buildings in California have to have fire sprinklers in them, which seemed weird, but I'm happy to have them. Our building materials, for example, the siding of a house is now all supposed to be hardy plank or something fire resistant. Hardy plank is it looks like wood, but it's like 50% cement. So it just is very, very fire resistant. The design of our eaves and attics has been changed so that fire can't suck up under the eaves and get up into the attic anymore. They redesigned the ventilation of attics to eliminate that problem. And there's been a vast effort to talk to people about landscaping. Plants like juniper go up like that, eucalyptus go up like that because they're all oily. Don't plant those things anymore. Don't put them right next to your house anymore. You know, if you live out in the country, keep a defensible cleared space around your place, that kind of thing. Very strong efforts to get that kind of thing done. Information pushed to the public, man. There's kind of a paradox here because, of course, our public in Sonoma County is all very interested in fire now because, you know, our houses burned down, and you know somebody whose house burned down. You wish you could get that feeling into people who haven't had that experience yet. But the fact is, everywhere you go, every county fair, anything you got, any book fair, there's firefighters out there with a booth like this, California Fire Safe Council, and they'll pass out little red backpacks full of everything you need to evacuate from a fire, that kind of thing. We've got these little boards, which I'm sure you have all around here too. This one's 2 blocks from my house right now, that this Boy Scout built as his Eagle project to tell everybody, you know, what the fire conditions are in the road going up from the path our fire took to get to us. What was interesting about this psychologically is we had neighbors who objected to this because they said, well, every time I drive by that corner, I'm going to be reminded of the fire that destroyed my house. And it made some people very sad. It was like a flashback PTSD thing for them. I understand, I sympathize for that. But the whole point of this is to prevent that from happening again. And so, you know, I don't know what to say to those people except it's for the greater good. Please focus on that. Institutions, active and ongoing. One of the people I interviewed for the paperback version of Firestory was our county supervisor, James Gore, who was politically responsible for much of the territory that burned. And Gore talked to me about the fact that the night of our fire, people had emergency plans, and they pulled the binder off and they blew the dust off it and they opened it up, and there was nothing in there about what to do in case of this kind of thing, or if there was, it was so far from meeting the reality of the situation. He said something like, you know, we were ready for slow-moving disasters like a flood that you see coming, or like the Henley fire that burns for 5 days. We were not prepared for fire raining from the sky. And so you have to have not just the plan, but it has to be a well-conceived plan, and it has to be a living document that always is updated and changed, and responding to new information, new needs, and that everybody knows their role. You know, people who are hired onto a position and get told what their responsibility is in the next disaster. It has to be an active, ongoing, living process and document that pushes out into the community. This is my rendering of James Gore, which I don't know if he'd find flattering, but in his interview with me, he said this. He said, the idea of resilience is not that you never get hit. It's that when you do get hit, you can take it. He said, people talk about the new normal in the context of it being a horrible, apocalyptic, changing environment. I say that the new normal is how we rise to that challenge. The new normal is us. And I think that's right. If people talk about the new normal in terms of climate change and this and that, I think the new normal is going to be how we respond, how we prepare for it. And we're going to get knocked down. The question is, how do you get back up? And Sonoma County is more ready to get back up than it was in 2017, and I hope the same for Hood River County and everybody everywhere else. This is the last drawing in the hardcover edition of the book, the daffodils pushing up through the ground. And I never tell anybody how to interpret any of my books. People come to me and say, oh, here's what I got out of your book. And that is not at all what I intended, but I say, thank you very much. I'm glad you got that out of my book. So I never tell anybody how to interpret my books, but if somebody wanted to look at my drawings of daffodils and see a message of resilience and of life arising from lifelessness and a life coming from death and renewal and rebirth, I would not discourage that interpretation. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions y'all have for me. Thank you. Sir.
There was far more fuel for that second one than the first one, the sixth one.
Yes.
And so, like we were talking about,
Yeah.
there was many years to manage So, you know, like regulations, is such a big factor.
I'll repeat it for people seeing online who probably didn't hear you. Yeah, the question is about the role of forest management, wild fire or wild land management, particularly in light of the context of the '64 fire compared to the 2017 fire. How they managed that land so that the fuel didn't grow enough to burn again in 2017. The fact was, in our particular case, that was all private land, more or less. It wasn't national forest or state forest. It was private land. And as I recall the news stories, our fire started on a piece of private land that the owner did not allow the utility to come on and clear the trees. So a line fell down and it started a spark and it started a fire. And so that kind of gets back to that whole conflict between private and public rights and public and private spaces. In balance on large, I think you're absolutely right. It does come down to there's a lot of room for regulation to prevent this kind of thing, to manage wildlands better, manage forests better. But, and there you get into the conflicts again too of, well, there's state land, there's federal land. The political figures have said things like, well, if we just manage our forests better, and then you say to them, well, that was a federal forest, you could have been managing that better. That's, or that was a state forest, that wasn't their job, or it was private land, and then you've got to negotiate with 3,000 individual homeowners to do the right thing, or force them to do it, or mandate them to do it. And I am not an expert in these realms, but I think you're right. There's a role to be played for wise, enlightened management of wildlands. And I think, I mean, I'm not a forester, but I know people's attitudes on that are changing, right? That 50 years ago, the notion was if a fire springs up, you stamp it out immediately. And now people are seeing some value to letting some fires burn sometimes, just to prevent this kind of thing from happening, just to prevent a buildup of 50 years of fuel that's ready.
You put it in the microwave?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try. I mean, I'll just eat what I want of it.
About,
Yeah.
looked like it just happened fairly recent. Just that the sports are looking at how it happened before.
Right.
2 minutes.
Probably
2.
oh that much. But the next time one would come through, they could still live because there wasn't so much fuel around.
Yeah.
So the protection is kind of
Oh, exactly right. And what we see in Sonoma County is that the native trees, the native valley oaks and things like that, they survived the fire pretty well because they were built to survive fires like this. Because they used to, as you said, every 200. The native valley oaks, they got burned and they dropped a bunch of acorns, and now there's a bunch of little oaks spreading. Good for the oaks, and same with redwoods. Redwoods are built to take fire. Redwoods have bark that's thick, and it's hard to burn a redwood. And then if you do burn a redwood, it just sprouts out new branches, and in 50 years you got yourself another redwood. That doesn't do homes much good. But there are actually a lot of. I find this fascinating. Actually, around our county, there are places you can go and you can say, this place is going to look horrible for 40 years. And there are other places you can go and you can't even tell there's been a fire there 5 years after the fire. And it's some of the things you mentioned, some of the differences in what's there, what was there before, and what it's been hundreds of years. I find that fascinating. Yes, sir.
wondering, the idea that climate change itself, what we're seeing is a result of climate change. Whereas
Yes.
that, it's seen, I remember growing up in Southern California, the Santa Ana winds came every year.
Right.
And that's not exactly climate change. I think it's a thing. What has happened is that people's population trends, where they want to live, all of these things have made it impossible to escape these fires.
Yeah. Well, that's a little bit what I was talking about was between the Hanley fire and our Tubbs fire was one of the big differences was people moved into these areas that were prone to fire. But, and I think that's part of it, but I'm going to be the physics major who was really good at atmospheric thermodynamics for a little bit, and say I'm more convinced than I ever was that climate change is contributing to a lot of this. Just the idea that California can have its most destructive wildfires 6 years in a row, each year more destructive than the last cumulatively, is just, you know, it's a data point. It's a data point. And I know the Santa Anas have been horrible, and for centuries. I mean, Santa Anas have been around for thousands of years probably. And yeah, people build their houses in the Malibu canyons, and then the Malibu canyons catch fire, and then the mudslides, and it's, maybe those people shouldn't be there. But what we're seeing is pervasive, you know, continent scale changes in precipitation, in heat, in, you know, all these things. I mean, what's been happening in the Arctic and the Antarctic is unprecedented for hundreds of thousands of years. The climate is changing, and it's, you know, again, the atmospheric thermodynamic physicist in me says the reason it's changing is because we're doing it.
The impact of change is on the population growth in these areas where people have moved in.
Yeah.
That were never there before.
Not always. Not always.
All I'm saying is that population, that climate change has been there for a long time. I'm not a denier of climate change, okay?
Right.
But what I'm saying is that the real change that's come about is the population.
Oh, I won't argue that, sure.
And that's
Sure.
why there's such a devastating effect. People have moved into areas that have forever been under huge pressure from fire. But it was managed because the population wasn't there.
I'll give you that. Understood. Understood. Does anybody have any other questions about? I am not a fire expert. I'm pretty good at getting books published and things like that. If anybody has any questions about things like that, yes.
I'm just curious whether you were informed about the fire that came up the gorge.
Was I informed about the fire that came up the gorge? I certainly was. I mean, I understood that was one reason they asked me to come in the first place. But I remember when it happened. You know, I paid attention to the news when it happened, and was, you know, appropriately horrified and worried for folks up here, because it was so very similar to what had happened to us, you know. Yeah, I did, and we drove through that, of course, coming up here from Portland, and my wife and I just had chills up and down our spine because it just looks like home. You know, it was terrible, and we understand.
At least they stopped it right behind the Multnomah Falls Lodge.
Yeah.
They saved the lodge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sir.
What's your next project?
What's my next project? Well, I've got that giant robot book coming out in the fall. You can all look for that. I'm working on a new project that I'm not talking too much about yet. I'm a little superstitious about that because if you blab it out and then it doesn't happen, and then people for the next 5 years ask you, hey, what happened to that thing? You have to say, well, it didn't happen. So, but I am working on a new project that's that interests me. I'll say this. I've gotten to kind of a point in my career where I've realized that if I don't enjoy doing a project, other people won't enjoy reading it. So I kind of look for things that just tickle me, that I just love doing, that it's just like, I can't wait to get in there and just like work on it. And I've got one of those. So I'm doing that. And whether it ever gets published or anybody else ever sees it, sort of doesn't matter to me. I'm doing it for, you know, self-gratification, I guess, just to make myself happy. And then what I've discovered is that tends to be the stuff that other people like to read. So I'm hoping for the best. Yeah.
Did your city have an evacuation plan within your housing development?
Did our city have an evacuation plan within the housing development? No, not at all. And we had a problem because the major way in and out of our city was Highway 101, which is north-south, and it got kind of cut off at both ends. So after you do that, then your next route is to go out toward the Pacific Ocean, which is a lot of, you know, narrow roads that don't handle a lot of people. There was no planned evacuation route, and if there had been planned evacuation routes, they would have just been screwed up anyway because the fire was just everywhere. One of the stories I tell about in the book is Karen was in charge of evacuating a children's home we had just outside the city limits. And any evacuation plan would have been useless because the routes north, west, and east were totally cut off. And the only way out was, this windy road that nobody would have ever had the thought to put into an evacuation plan. So Karen did some heroic work that night, just getting those kids out of that children's home. She had to, everything was evacuated, everything was barricaded off, and she had at the time some private investigators who worked worked for her as part of her department. She had a few cops working for her, and she had to tell one of them, look, just go up there, flash your badge, get in there, and get those kids out. I don't care how you do it. And he did, but what plan's going to cover that you happen to know a guy with a badge who can go get the kids out, But one of the things that was interesting, and Karen has never told me I'm wrong about this, so I'm going to keep repeating it, thinking it's right, is that what struck me most about our response was the importance of flexibility and improvisation and knowing what resources you had at your command. Because, for example, Karen had a phone tree to call that night, but most people didn't know there was a disaster. So who picks up their phone at 3 in the morning? Nobody. Nobody was answering their phone. So she's going down the list of all these people she's supposed to call in case of emergency. They're not answering their phone. Maybe the next morning she starts to get a few of them. But if somebody's living in a southern town like Petaluma, and their job is to get up to a northern town like Healdsburg, they can't do that because the highway's closed. So what you do is you tell the Petaluma person, it's not your job, but go to the high school, bang on the door till they let you in, and open up a shelter there. And she could do that because she knew those people and she knew where they were, and she knew what she needed in that place. And she said, well, Steve lives there. Let's give Steve a call. But if you don't know that, and again, good luck putting that into a plan. The plan is be flexible. That's the plan.
Because I worry that we live in the valley.
Oh yeah.
And so if something like this should happen, if we go south, we couldn't go any fire.
Right.
We come out to 84, well, it's going to be jammed. It could be closed. So maybe I need to go to city council and county and ask, what is our evacuation plan in case something like this?
Yeah, the question is, or comment is about what would happen in a place like the Gorge where there are very few escape routes and they'll all be jammed up. You would learn a lot of lessons from the example of Paradise because they were in a very similar situation, Paradise, California, where they were, I think, in a valley and there was one road going one way and one road going the other way. And they did have an evacuation plan. The evacuation plan was like, I forget exactly, but it was something like Section A, Section B, Section C, geographic sections. A goes first, B goes first. Well, of course, on the night, that all goes to hell immediately. And everybody jams everything. And people died because everything got jammed. So I don't know what they've done to solve that problem. In fact, I don't think there's much of Paradise there to solve the problem. People haven't moved back yet. But I think Paradise would be very instructive to a situation like you've got here, where you're geologically constrained like that, to try to put a lot of people through a small, fire hose, through a small opening. You got to have a plan. Yeah. I don't know what it is.
That's several plans. That's a good question to track down on Tuesday night with the Firewise living in the Gorge, because Glenn Ahrens knows, he'll have answers for you.
Come to the Firewise Living in the Gorge talk on Tuesday. Attend that. Yes. I'm saying that out loud so the folks on the web can hear it.
It's here at 7 p.m. It's also on Zoom. So if you go to your library website and look under our programs, you'll find the Zoom link and you can watch it the same way.
Terrific. Thank you. My time is way up, but please.
I just wanted to mention the John Lewis graphic novel that you mentioned.
Yes,
earlier.
March.
There are surely multiple states which that cannot now be taught in the schools. Am I correct?
She's asking about the John Lewis graphic novel March about civil rights and asking if there are states where that currently cannot be taught. I'm not personally aware of it being banned anywhere yet. I wouldn't be surprised if it got there, but it's just straight up history. That doesn't seem to make a difference. I'm not aware of it being banned anywhere. I have a friend named Maya Kobe who lives in my area and wrote a book called Genderqueer. It's getting banned everywhere. You don't write a book called Genderqueer and have it get too much traction these days. It's a wonderful book, and it's an important book that could change some young people's lives, and it's a shame that those young people might not get a chance to see it.
I'm just assuming Lewis's book would be considered critical race theory.
I have no idea. I mean, I've read the book. I didn't see any critical race theory in it. It's about being a black person in the 60s. So there you go. Thank you all very much. And thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you all so much for being here. I hope that if you haven't gotten a chance, I'm assuming that, how many of you have actually read the book? Yeah, that's what I thought. Well, we see we gave it to them.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for supporting this program. Also want to say, if any of you have been watching us through the years and think, gee, it might be fun to be on that committee, please come and talk to one of us. We have some openings and we would love to have some fresh ideas. So check that out. Also, yes, moving forward, if anyone has some good ideas for a book that would meet the criteria that we've mentioned, we really, right now is when we start gathering all of your recommendations. So please do that as well. Thank you. And Brian.
And if you brought your books, I'd be very happy to sign them. That's the least I can do. So.
Oh, that.
Thank you.
Oh, I gave mine away.